Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of our digital series, Coleslaw's Corner, Science in Drag. I'm James Wetzel, the producer of adult programs at the Museum of Science, and I'm so thrilled to introduce this important conversation tonight. We have been so lucky and thrilled to continue our work with the one and only Coleslaw over the past couple of months while the museum has been closed. We've had a blast putting her in conversations with different experts and researchers from our team here at the museum and exploring different STEM-related topics and research and professions and really introducing Coleslaw as a new voice in STEM. And tonight we have a very special one. We're so lucky to have Sarah Weiner from the museum's education department with us. She and Coleslaw do a deep dive into the underrepresented and hidden stories in STEM history, digging into the contributions that women and the LGBTQ community and Black scientists have made to the field, as well as to our life and society today. And it's definitely a very special one. I feel honored that we were able to present it and bring it into all of your homes this evening. And I hope that you all are able to learn a little bit more about these incredible, incredible humans. And tonight is a part of our current virtual season of adult programs. We have turned the Museum of Science into a virtual museum, offering free STEM-related content on a daily basis through our digital platforms. And as a part of that, we launched our Subspace Adult Programs After Dark channel to host tonight's conversation, as well as the rest of our upcoming lineup. We have about a month left of our virtual summer season with some incredible events and experiences still to come, still to even be announced. So I urge you to keep an eye out on our lineup and keep coming back and hanging out with us after dark this summer. And keep an eye out for a very special announcement on our upcoming fall season in the near future as well. But in the meantime, I need to thank our friends from the Lowell Institute for their continued support of the adult programming here at the museum. Without them, we would not be here tonight. This event would not be happening, and it would not be free. So please join me in giving a huge round of applause and thanks to our friends at the Lowell Institute. And finally, after the show tonight, I ask you to please consider making a gift to support MOS at Home. You can go to donate.mos.org/MOS at Home. That link should be on your screen now. And become a vital partner in education by helping us provide access to STEM experiences online, just like tonight's. We thank you for being here again. I hope that you enjoy this. And now I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Coleslaw. Take it away.
Hello, it's Coleslaw here, reporting live straight from my laboratory into your interweb camera screen. First of all, I just want to say that you look really good today. Yeah, you do. I would like to encourage all of you watching right now to give yourselves a hearty pat on the back, because if you are viewing, listening, or reading the words that are currently coming out of my mouth, it means that you have successfully survived halfway through the year from hell, aka 2020. We've been dealing with a worldwide pandemic, unheard of numbers of unemployment, a nationwide depression, murder hornets, an incompetent and bigoted leader who acts more like a child than a president, and a social revolution. An estimated 15 to 26 million people have participated in the Black Lives Matter protests that have taken place all across the country, therefore making Black Lives Matter one of the largest protests that have ever taken place in the United States. Yes, you heard that right. One of the largest movements in the history of the United States of America. Don't let anyone, especially media, downplay the importance of what we are witnessing. While doing research for this video, I began to think about the stereotypical image of a scientist that I have floating around in my brain. A tall, older, gangly-looking Caucasian man with tufts of white hair sprouting out on the sides of his head. He wears a long lab coat, smeared with grease, with black rubber gloves pulled up to the elbow. There is a sinister grin on his mouth as he pours a thick, bubbling, neon green liquid from one test tube to the other. The scientist cackles as bright lightning strikes down right behind him, throwing shadows all across the laboratory. Now I am aware that the image that I have of scientists stems from my love of horror films, as well as my obsession with the Frankenstein. Surely there is a deeper and darker seated reason why I immediately picture the scientist as a Caucasian male. The Museum of Science Boston and I have decided to investigate diversity in science and bring you some of the historical figures from STEM who haven't been properly acknowledged for their work and contributions due to gender identity, orientation, or race. I have summoned our very extra special guest, Sarah Weiner, who is the Education Associate in Live Presentations and Current Science and Technology at the Museum of Science Boston. Sarah is a 28-year-old, 5'9" Leo who puts the B in the LGBT. She has degrees from Boston University in astronomy and physics. And she has a special love for Mars and all of its beautiful mysteries. Sarah has been a beloved employee of the Museum of Science for a wonderful 7 years. Let's get this conversation started! Hello, everyone. I am so excited to introduce you all to Sarah Weiner from the Museum of Science Boston. And she is here, and she is queer, and she is going to let us know all about these diverse arrays of scientists. And where are you, Sarah? Can you hear me, Sarah?
I hear you. I see you. And that is the best intro I've ever gotten. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah. It's so
Hi,
nice
Coleslaw.
to meet you.
You look
I love your
beautiful.
glasses.
Thanks. They're real. I need them to see.
I love that fact. So, Sarah, we're here to speak on diversity in science because it has come to my attention, as well as the attention of the museum staff, that there are so many voices that need to be uplifted. Let's let everyone know how many spectrums of humans have been involved in the history of science. Shall we?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So, Sarah, when we speak about science, we use the term STEM, which is an acronym, STEM. Can you elaborate on what those letters stand for?
So it's funny because the first S just stands for science. So you might think, well, we've already got all of it then. We started too general. But science, technology, engineering, and math. And so those are, these sort of technical pursuits that the Museum of Science cares a lot about, a lot of different, they're kind of interconnected.
I love that. I had no idea what that meant before last week. So I just really need to know what your role is. Lay it on me. I'm new to the Museum of Science. Here I am. I'm walking in. Oh,
It's
hello,
so good
young
to see
lady.
you, Coleslaw.
Hello, young lady. Tell me what you do here.
I am an educator at the Museum of Science. So I work in live presentations. So you find me up on stages sometimes at the museum talking about lightning or current science or an animal or liquid nitrogen or all kinds of things. We have to be all over the museum talking about all kinds of stuff. That's my public facing part of my job and is hugely, hugely fun. It's the best job in the world.
So let's kick this off with a name that most of us are familiar with. Leonardo da Vinci, who was an artist, but they're also known for more than just painting the Last Supper and the Mona Lisa.
Exactly. So Leonardo da Vinci was an inventor extraordinaire, which is honestly the best job and is a job I wish still existed. He was sort of just, his job was to just be clever and inventive, and boy was he. This is during a period of history in which there was such a renaissance of new ideas coming to Europe, and Leonardo da Vinci was in many ways at the center of that. Of course, his art is really famous, but the museum even hosted a Da Vinci exhibit a couple of years ago that was all about his inventions. So his flying machines and his diving apparatus and all of these things that he sort of thought of. And of course, in cinematic great movie Ever After, he's in there as an inventor too, right?
Oh my God.
Remember, he shows up with he has the
I'm not
boat
even
shoes?
kidding. I'm not even kidding. Do you see it?
Danielle! He was this sort of wildly popular figure, and by all accounts, he was also queer. He was found guilty of sodomy, although not guilty. He was accused of sodomy, but because couple of the other guys he was with, one of them was a Medici, which were like the Kennedys of this time period in Italy, and so this was really hurriedly like swept under the rug. He really spent almost all of his life with men, in the company of men. He was said to be very beautiful and vivacious, and so I think it's pretty hard to deny that Da Vinci was queer. He was pretty much a boy's boy, as they say in the time. But yeah.
Well, he definitely paid a lot of detail to the male body. Let's just say that much.
Sure did. Yeah, John the Baptist. That the face of his John the Baptist is based on one of his lovers. So that's bold.
I'm obsessed with this conversation already.
It's going great. We just started.
Moving right along, the second name that I want to bring up is Dr. James Berry, who was a groundbreaking physician with an extraordinarily secret life. Can you elaborate on Dr. James Berry?
Yeah, James Berry is one of my favorites. He was a surgeon. He is the first one. He was English, and he was the first person to successfully perform a cesarean section. To live birth through surgery. So this is obviously a life-saving procedure, hugely important. Actually, I'm a
C-section baby.
Me too. I'm a twin.
Big
so yeah, so a lot of people, including these two wonderful people on this call right here, wouldn't be here today if it weren't for James Berry and his development of C-section techniques. He was in the Navy. He did all kinds of things. And then when he died, only after his death and upon an autopsy, it was found that he did not appear to have been, as they said at the time, born a man. In nowadays sort of terminology, we would call him a transgender man, probably. He lived his entire life as a man. As soon as he was able to kind of strike off on his own, he did so. He only used the name James Berry. He never used his dead name. He was, and he had this whole life where he was a well-known, like, cantankerous Navy surgeon who developed all these techniques. And upon his death in that autopsy, it was even found that he may have, as a teenager, been pregnant himself, and that may have affected his decision to pursue this career. And so, there's this tendency, I think, to sometimes think of things like this as like all Mulan style, right? Like, oh, maybe this is just something that, someone really wanted to be a doctor but couldn't go to medical school. That is not the case here. James Berry's decision to live his life his way was probably less of a decision and probably more about his true identity as a trans man. So,
which was so courageous, even more so than we can even imagine, because I'm sure, like, back then the punishment was like horrendous.
Right. Well, and it kind of also makes you think, right? Like, that doesn't tell us this is not the, oh, James Berry is the exception of like, oh, we found out that there was one trans man. This is more a sign of like, probably there are a lot of people throughout history. I'm not going to say like a US president or something, but there have been people throughout history who have been trans, who have been queer, who have lived their lives that way. There might have been different terminology or no terminology at the time.
Well, I mean, that brings up a topic that I was going to bring up at a later time, but the whole, the topic of homosexuals existing throughout time with the fear of coming out, it just wasn't something that you could openly do. obviously. Maybe some young people take for granted all of the rights that we have today in 2020. But can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, totally. And that's, I mean, I think that's a great point to bring up, is that of course there are still struggles, of course there are still things, but especially in the queer community, we need to make sure that we're looking back and thinking of, you know, looking at our Marsha P. Johnsons and looking at, you know, who was there at the beginning, who was there really fighting the fight.
Put her picture up here.
Yes, yeah, put with like a angel halo.
With a halo.
It's just sort of, at some point, you are failing to imagine the world as diverse as it has always been. So there have always been trans people, there have always been queer people, there have always been Black people, there have always been these varieties of humanity, and they've always been doing science, because science is the pursuit of knowledge of our world. And so anyone who has ever gone out wondering, you know, how do we do this? How can we figure this out? That's a scientist. And some of those discoveries have changed the path of human history. And to pretend that those discoveries have only been made by like nice married white couples with their 2.5 children is absurd. You know, there are so many different ways of being a person who's asking these questions about the world. And I think in a lot of ways, the more marginalized an identity is, then the harder it is for them to, you know, make it through the annals of history. So I think that's sort of part of why that happens.
Which is an amazing thing to bring up, because in our current social climate and revolution with Black Lives Matter, we need to realize that those perceptions of white people being this like intellectual superiority complex is not real, and it's something that's been drilled in our heads from an early age, and I think that this is the perfect time for us to start to contextualize everything and read up and listen to things like this, so you know that that's what they want you to know. That's what history
is, right? History is told by the winners. And I think
also Pride was started by Black trans women of color, and that is the most important thing to know. So as gay, queer, trans, bi, gender fluid humans, we need to acknowledge the trans community, specifically trans people of color, and they do matter, and we should be very grateful for what they've contributed to our society. Let's take a moment to acknowledge the women who've laid the foundations of STEM. And what does STEM mean again? Science, technology,
engineering, and math.
Oh my God, STEM. I hate math. First on our list of women in science through history who have not really had the spotlight that they deserve is Hypatia of Alexandria. They were one of the first female mathematicians in recorded history, which is incredible.
Yeah, she was rad. I actually know her mostly for her work in astronomy, but that's because, especially prior to like the Renaissance, a lot of scientists or mathematicians were known as natural philosophers, and they just did everything. They just sort of did whatever. So they were like doing biology experiments over here, and then doing chemistry over here, and then doing physics or math. So people were kind of dabbling into lots of different things. And yeah, one of those, Hypatia, was amazing. She was a mathematician, and she, like other sort of earlier Hellenistic philosophers you might know, like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, she was a lecturer. So she would lecture on natural world things, and she was quite famous. People would come from all over to see her lectures. A lot of times people will make fun of, you know, the pre-Copernican folks for thinking that Earth was at the center of our solar system. And what I always try to remind people of is that the reason we believed that for so long is because there was this very rigorous model of the way the universe worked. It was developed by this guy, Ptolemy with a P, like pterodactyl. And Ptolemy's model was so rigorous, and it was really, really good at predicting when the planets would come out, when you would see certain constellations, even with things like eclipses. So like it worked, and that's why it lasted for so long. It lasted for over 1,000 years. And part of the reason that it worked so well is because Hypatia of Alexandria did a sort of an edit of Ptolemy's model. She had a sort of, she wrote her own sort of update to it. And a lot of people credit that for being the sort of little edge on track. So she was wrong. It was a geocentric model. It was an Earth-centered model of the universe. But she, you know, these calculations that she did were able to sort of make these predictions last way longer. So in some ways, she probably sort of made things take a little longer. And then she was killed by a mob. Yeah, she was killed by a Christian mob for being a heretic, for being a pagan. A lot of bad things happened for a lot of people at the time, and Hypatia was one of them. Not because she was a woman, but because she was a pagan. So and then it's funny because ever since then, you know, she was so famous, and her death was quite shocking that she was kind of thought of as this like martyr for science. You know, she died with her beliefs or something. But then in the like 1600s, people said that she was this perfect virginal, like saint-like figure, and some people say that she inspired St. Catherine or depictions of St. Catherine. There's all these things, right, where she's been kind of co-opted several times through her history. She's been brought up as an anti-Catholic figure, but, you know, really, she was just a genius. I mean, she was a genius. She was a brilliant woman. She was a philosopher working in her time period. She was accepting of other religions, not so much other religions of her, but she was rad. Yeah, she was awesome.
I gotta say, something that always blows my mind, other than the fact that pyramids were built without machines, is the fact that they started the whole, you know, mathematician thing without any machines, because I can barely multiply. I'm kidding. So, coming up next, we have Miss Ada Lovelace.
Oh, yeah.
Not Linda. She's from England, around the time 1815, and they were a mathematician and one of the first computer programmers ever documented, which is crazy to think that computers have been being developed since literally the beginning of 1800, and look where we're at now. We hold computers in our hand like it's nothing.
So true. So Ada Lovelace was Lord Byron's daughter. She was super, super serious. She was a very dedicated, mathematically thinking person. And yeah, computers existed, but as these like clockwork machines that computed, right? So they were basically adding machines, so they could do simple calculations.
Were they made out of rocks?
And they were made out of metal. This is luckily in a time where people did know a little bit more. But I mean, like, there was wood. Wood was involved in it, and like paper rolls. So think of like a player piano. That's a computer. But Ada Lovelace learned about this computer and was basically like, okay, so it can do calculations. Couldn't it also be given a more complicated set of instructions, which is what we would now call an algorithm? And she was instrumental in sort of in developing that first program. So basically giving a computer a set of instructions and saying, I'm going to input this and you give me something out. You process this and then give me the answer. That's kind of what they were used for. And one of my favorite things about her, and the reason that I brought up, other than the fact that he's like the disaster buy of all disaster buys, the reason I brought up Lord Byron as her father is because she actually was very well known for having what was thought of as quite a poetical view of the universe. So she was really interested in how computers could affect people. So that's, I think, why a lot of people are starting to look back at Ada Lovelace now, even though she's far predates, you know, what we would think of as modern computers. She had this thoroughly modern idea of how technology and culture could be connected. So she was really interested in, could this machine be made to create music? Could it be made to answer questions given to it by children? So she was really incredibly forward thinking to, again, imagine like this is a woman in 1830 who is sitting there being like, wouldn't it be fascinating if someday people had these in their homes and they just helped them answer questions? I mean, it's amazing.
Sarah, do you believe in time travel?
What I like to think of is I love to think of like, imagine if you could bring Ada Lovelace to now and be like, girl, you are so right. Like,
Yeah.
look at this. Look at this. You would never have known that this was going to be a thing, but like,
I don't
it
know.
totally was.
Her head might get a little big if you did that. Anyways, Annie Jump Cannon.
Oh, my favorite.
That sounds like a musical title.
It does.
Annie Jump Cannon. This is the first American woman on this list of scientists, and they were around 1863, famous for astronomy. So tell me, what did Annie Jump Cannon do that's so special?
So Annie Jump Cannon, and it's pretty hard to talk about Annie Jump Cannon without also talking about her contemporary Henrietta Swan Leavitt. So those are two great names. So they were
divas. Let's not lie. They were divas with a name like that.
Such a great Annie Jump Cannon is the coolest name ever. I love it. So they were working. They are the perfect example of what we're talking about here in the 19th century of what would a pattern that would then be repeated with Black women in the mid 20th century with like Hidden Figures and the human computers. So that's exactly what Annie Jump Cannon and Henrietta Swan Leavitt were. They were at Harvard, and they were known as like secretaries or assistants. And what they were doing is they were looking at photographic plates. Now this is before you could take a picture there's no Polaroid, right? There's no film. They worked for this guy named Pickering. And they were known as Pickering's women, or sometimes less flatteringly, Pickering's harem, because he had a whole group of, I know, right? Thank you. That's the exact face that should be made every time Pickering's harem is said. But they worked as assistants looking at these stellar photography plates to classify stars. And that might seem kind of like just like something that scientists do for kicks and giggles to be like, let's just decide. But it actually was hugely important for understanding how our star works, how big the universe is. All of these different questions were kind of based around like, what are stars? How do they work? But the real story is that they were doing incredible science on their own. Annie Jump Cannon is responsible for classifying the biggest number of stars that any single person has ever classified. She came up with a classification system for temperatures of stars that we still use to this day.
Wow.
And Henrietta Swan Leavitt was really fascinated by these stars called variable stars that basically get brighter and then dimmer and brighter and dimmer at a predictable period. And she was able to determine that you could use that as a measure for distance. And that's kind of one of the big problems in astronomy is measuring distance, because like there's only so much tape measure, right? Like you can't just give a tape measure to an astronaut and be like, tell us how far the moon is, please, we want to know. So, astronomers have to come up with a lot more methods of determining distance, and the farther away something is, the harder it becomes to tell how far away it is. So Henrietta Swan Leavitt came up with this method using Cepheid candle, or what were known as standard candle stars, to determine distance. And her work was co-opted by Edwin Hubble. Insert villain music here. Edwin Hubble basically was taking her calculations using Cepheid variable stars. He was embroiled in this big debate about how big the universe was. And in like 1925, the Nobel Prize Committee sends a letter because they're like, Henrietta Swan Leavitt, you're amazing. You're so good at science. We want to give you the Nobel Prize for Physics. And she had already died by this point. And Edwin Hubble was like, you can just give it to me though, because she was basically doing my work. And so that's lame.
Shady
kind of like Rosalind Franklin, right? Exactly. So Henrietta Swan Leavitt, and what's also cool, this is personally always meant a lot to me because my mother and all of her siblings are deaf or hard of hearing. And Annie Jump Cannon and Henrietta Swan Leavitt were friends, and they were both deaf. One of them through congenital hearing loss, and one of them through scarlet fever. So that's another thing, right? Is that like, as we kind of talked about at the beginning, the more aspects of your identity that are non-normative, the harder, the more, like, if it can be ignored, it will be ignored. So skin color often can't be ignored, although there are some people who are historically like whitewashed. So skin color can't really be ignored, but something like sexual orientation washed away, right? Like, because maybe there were puritanical writers in the 1800s who were like, oh, we don't want to know that about Leonardo da Vinci, so they don't write that part, and they don't keep that in his biography. And so the same is true of Annie Jump Cannon and Henrietta Swan Leavitt. They were deaf women, and that is, I think, an important part of their work. It doesn't give them any magical ability to be better at things, but it is important to remember that that is yet another thing they were overcoming. And what breaks my heart is that Henrietta Swan Leavitt, her family was quite ashamed of her being an astronomer. So her grave, which is just across the river from me in Cambridge, was just like, she's in a family grave, and it just says like Henrietta Swan Leavitt, and nothing like beloved daughter. It doesn't say anything about her massive Nobel Prize worthy contributions to science. So a lot of people, myself included, will sometimes go, and I've left little, like, you know, those little, you're a millennial, you know, the like glow in the dark stars. People will sometimes leave those on her, on her headstone to be like, just to kind of acknowledge, like, look what she did.
Hidden Figures. Sarah, what a stellar film, and it teaches us so much about the struggles that these women went through and how much they saved those men's asses. So tell me, most of us have seen the film. Do you have a little bit more that you can tell us about these incredible women, the real life women, Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, and Dorothy Vaughan, who were three very important women of color who helped NASA?
So this is, again, it just follows right off of that tradition of Tycho Brahe, of your Pickering, of having women be doing this work that is like analytical work, but also is a huge amount of calculation, because a computer, while there were what we would now call computers, supercomputers that filled big, huge rooms, there weren't, you know, these devices that you could use, and even like calculators weren't really a thing at this time. And so you had to have people who could do these incredible calculations by hand. And Katherine Johnson is probably most well known for her mathematical prowess, whereas Dorothy Vaughan was a supervisor who worked a great deal with the actual computer. She was famous for learning some of that machine code and being able to do some of those algorithms, real, you know, Ada Lovelace style, except much more advanced. And, you know, I think that I love the movie also. I mean, it was so well acted, so beautifully casted, and I think is largely quite accurate. I know that it is true that John Glenn specifically requested that Katherine Johnson be in the room, and be the one who did his calculations for his first orbit of the Earth. That is true.
That wasn't really like just dramatic.
But she didn't have to do them all. She didn't do the calculations then. Like, they had been done. She had already done the calculations, but he specifically requested that she do them because she was so well known. The one thing about that movie that kind of I thought was a letdown, and is something that I think is pretty interesting and important to talk about, especially when you are really thinking about how these stories get told, is, so Kevin Costner's character in the movie, right? He's like this NASA administrator who is like, he hires Katherine Johnson, and he's like, why are you gone for so long going to the bathroom? And why haven't you,
Wait, that was
been
Kevin
back?
Costner?
Yeah.
Right over my head. Anyways.
So that's cool. It's a nice thought. But it's not accurate, actually. This guy, so like in the movie, there's like this really inspiring scene where he's like, why are you gone all day? And she's like, I have to go to the bathrooms because they're segregated bathrooms. I have to walk really far. It wasn't actually Katherine Johnson who did that, but it did still happen. There were at some times, I guess there was a segregated campus, but Katherine Johnson just used the whites only bathroom. And so it's kind of, girl. I know this might seem kind of like quibbling, but I think it's actually really important, because this Kevin Costner character is not real. He's like one of the only characters in the movie who's just like not even really, he's not a real person. It's like Harrison or something. He's not a real guy. He's fully fictional. And his role in the movie, I think, is to make white people feel better about ourselves. To be
definitely,
like,
100%.
I would have been the cool NASA administrator who was like, this sign is stupid. You can use whatever bathroom you want. But like, the truth is that man didn't exist. And I don't just mean like that man Harrison didn't exist. I mean, that man didn't exist for Katherine Johnson. She did not have some white ally who helped her rise. She did it on her own. Allegedly, when she first started, the bathrooms were still technically segregated, but because she was, it was just like everyone knows. So she was like, well, I'm just going to ignore that then. And she just used that bathroom. So in a way, I know that's like a less exciting story, but it's important to give agency to, especially when we're talking about how these Black women, their contributions to science have been overlooked for so long. I think it's also important to not like give ourselves too much of a pat on the back and be like, there were some, there was that one white guy who believed in her. Like, he didn't exist. I know they just named a new building after her at NASA, which is cool.
The thing that struck me about that film was the segregation, the bathrooms, the water fountains, the bus. It's like, that was real. And I feel like we don't remember how, like, not so long ago that was only like 40 or 50 years ago or 60, but even still, not even 100 years ago, for God's sakes. How long has this country been around?
Right, exactly. Like, if you think of the fact that, so the first slaves were brought to America in 1619? Something like that. So like, we're looking at 400 years of like, where that's the introduction of Black people to America is as slaves. They're slaves for 250 years as we move all the way forward to 1865, and then we enter right into Jim Crow, and Jim Crow carries us all the way up until segregation, and then segregation leads directly into redlining in the prison industrial complex. So what's really important, a lot of times we as Americans have a difficult time imagining Black people as people. And I really mean that seriously. I think there is such a history of, so like Halle Berry is the first Black actress to win Best Actress Academy Award for Monster Ball. And she's also like one of the first women to be Black women to be nominated for playing a role that wasn't a maid or a slave. So there's this kind of idea that like Black people weren't invented till 1700, and then even then, like, they weren't doing anything except being subjugated. Which it's important to remember the incredible amount of impact that chattel slavery, like the trauma that has put into the bodies of the African diaspora. But it's also important to know that like Black people are also scientists, and Black people are and have been scientists even during the era of slavery. And I think that's really important to remember, that like just because segregation happened, just because all these things happened, like it didn't stop them from being brilliant. And in some cases, if we're lucky, it didn't stop them from contributing to science. But in many cases, it probably did. In many cases, there are probably brilliant people who had no chance to contribute because of the many barriers they faced.
While we're on a roll of speaking of groundbreaking work by Black scientists through history, let's speak on a few of these names that I have here. Benjamin Banneker is one of the more well-known names from the US. They were an astronomer, and they invented America's first clock made entirely out of wood, were largely self-taught, and one of the first African Americans to gain distinction in science.
Yeah, so Benjamin Banneker was awesome. He was a Black man in America. He was never a slave, but during like the late 1700s. So this is really just during like when everything was popping off. Benjamin Banneker was here, and he was a surveyor. So that's another thing that I think about a lot, is that like we're so used to just having like Google Maps be able to tell us where we are at any given time, but before there were satellites or planes or anything to help us look at the ground, people had to build maps and do surveys of land by hand, using hand calculations and tools and all kinds of stuff. So Benjamin Banneker was one of the people who was sort of exploring like Maryland, and he was like surveying, and he was basically trying to map everything. And so this led to him writing an almanac. Almanacs have kind of a tricky history in science, because like they're not really scientific. Like, what the weather was on this day last year doesn't really tell you anything about the weather is going to be like on this day this year, but it is still part of an important oral history of knowledge, which I think is important to remember, is that like it is part of this long tradition of being like, this is when the harvest starts, this is when whatever. So he's writing an almanac, but that included a prediction for an eclipse, which is wild. He was able to predict a solar eclipse. And so, yeah, Benjamin Banneker was just this really great, a figure very similar to like Benjamin Franklin. He was doing a lot of the same kind of work.
Okay, we also have a local Boston person, Miss Rebecca Lee Crumpler. She was the first Black woman to earn a medical degree. She was known as the Doctoress of Medicine. And she focused her work on very poor people who would not otherwise have access to medical care, which I think is super special. And can you tell me more about her?
Yeah, so Rebecca Crumpler was born in the 1830s, and she also was born free. She was never a slave. And at this time, it was like pretty rare. It was possible in some parts of the North for like Black people to be formally educated, but it wasn't especially common. And it was very, very rare for them to pursue the medical field beyond nursing. And she was the first Black woman in America to be a doctor. She kind of went away from Boston and into the South and began to provide medical care, not just for people who were needy, but specifically for freed slaves and freed children. Because, so she's born in 1831, so she's 34 years old when emancipation comes through. So there's all of these people who have basically never received medical care beyond whatever could keep them working. And so she was known as a freedman doctor. So freedman, like Freedman. So she's a freedman doctor. So she worked largely pro bono, providing medical services to freed slaves who had maybe never been given medical treatment in their entire lives, children who had never been given medical treatment, because like, why would people had doctors on site to like help if a slave broke an arm, but there was no sort of preventative or palliative care for slaves.
I cannot believe that I don't know this person already. Like, how is this not someone that...
She was awesome. She was a real...
It's crazy. The way that they pick and choose who to teach kids in school is just so crazy.
Like there is work that was done, and I think specifically it's really, really important to talk about the history of Black people and medical history here in America, because the father of gynecology, Sims, he experimented on enslaved Black women. He was born in 1813. He began doing his work and he developed, so like the entire field of gynecology has really, really dark roots, because like everything that was done, the speculum, everything was designed and tested without anesthetic on the bodies of Black women. It's a specifically really important thing to talk about, to recognize that for a Black woman to go and provide free medical care to freed slaves is so much more impactful and important than, the fact that, like, of course, I'm sure there were lots of people who were doing this sort of work, but she worked through so much adversity. I think she was known for, like, she would literally sit in the front row of her classes so she wouldn't hear all of the, like, snide remarks that were said about her. And, she worked to pursue this practice of medicine. And she is someone who, if she had been born maybe a little bit earlier or in the wrong place, like her body could have been experimented on as well. But instead, she was able to become this doctor and provide care. I think it's a beautiful story, and I think it needs to be told in a way that, like Florence Nightingale is great, but like there have been other, female. Look at James Barry. He's a trans, as far as we can understand, a trans doctor who's working in women's health as well. And that's a specific perspective that, like, whatever J. Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, as he's called, this torturer, is given so much credit for a field that we now see was like full. It had queer people, it had Black people, it had people who were there to try to like do the work in a better way. But
Helen Octavia Dickens from Pennsylvania is the next name on my list. And they were alive all through the 1900s and passed away in 2001, which is like not that long ago. So tell me about this wonderful scientist.
So Helen this is important to remember. So she died in 2001. Her father was a freed slave. So like, just think about that for a second. This is not very long ago, you guys. This was like so recent. She is the first Black woman to be a member of the Surgeons Guild. So she's the first Black female surgeon in America.
Wow.
And she is hugely important because of her work with teen pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections. So she is kind of one of the first people to really start talking about the fact that like sex education needs to happen, because that is the reason that all of these, you know, these infections are running through the community, is because people don't have any ability or knowledge of how to prevent them. So she like leaves the hospital and starts doing this activism work where she's just sort of trying to talk about the ability, like family planning as an entire concept. Now, like, prophylactics exist at this point, right? Like there have been like lambskin condoms for literally thousands of years, but the idea of birth control and family planning as something you could go through, whether that just worked with like looking at cycles and all that stuff, was considered for a long time really taboo. And so that's how you end up with like a billion children who you can't take care of because nobody had family planning. And it was just like, this is just what happens. You end up with all these kids. And so Helen Dickens was working, she also is kind of one of the people, she starts to draw connections between cervical cancer and pap smears. So she's, and like sexually transmitted infections. So she starts to be like, people need to get pap smears, people need to be getting checked up, you need to look at your cervix, all these things. And she's a surgeon, but she's also this activist.
So Mamie Phipps Clark is the next name on our list of Black scientists. They're from Arkansas. They were born in 1917 and passed away in 1983. And they had a lot to do, an important role in the civil rights movement. Her and her husband demonstrated the concept of separate but equal, which provided a far from equal education for Black youth.
So Mamie Phipps Clark is most famous for the black doll experiment, in which, so it was this psychological experiment in which children were offered a doll, a baby doll, that was either a white baby doll or a black baby doll. And they asked children to explain their choice and why they made the choice they did. And they proved conclusively that even Black children preferred the white doll, and they had negative things to say about the black baby doll. So what this is one of the first conclusive, objectively, scientifically shown experiments that says internalized racism harms children. So racism is real, and it harms children, and it harms their own self-image. Now, this might just seem like it's kind of like a, okay, so that happens, but this study is huge. It's cited in Brown v. the Board of Education. It is used worldwide as like proof that, because this is during segregation, so this is during the time where the idea was separate but equal. So this is not, you know, the 1800s, we're educating Black children, but they're just in schools different from white children. But this showed that these Black children who were in these schools, these separate but equal schools, were still receiving such negative racial messaging from their society, from the world, that they were not receiving the same level of education. They were not receiving and they weren't experiencing the same level of emotional growth, because they were being basically stunted by a world that hated them. And they knew that they were lesser. And so they experienced real embodied reactions to that. And Mamie Phipps Clark, who is a Black woman, her work is instrumental in really winning, in a lot of ways, and this sounds harsh, but like the sympathy of white moderates. So there are people at this time period who are like, yeah, but like they're like, they really believed in their hearts that separate but equal was true. So these are like, you know, like like white Northerners who were like, no, it's great, like they're fine, we don't want, but seeing, you know, these, and there's video of these like 5-year-olds being like, I don't want that Black doll, she's ugly, when they themselves are Black. And that was enough to really start to get through to people such a beautiful and clear cut way for, you know, I'm white, so I've never experienced racism, but to like watch this child, hurts me to watch this child. So how does it feel for Black people to see this? And how does it feel to know that this is like a real thing?
We should be uncomfortable, and we should be having uncomfortable conversations, because it's important to know that these things happened, and it is a part of our history as a country. And
well, and here's what I think. The reason that I'm a science educator, right? And what I think is so important about this is to realize that for every one of these stories that we know, there are countless stories that never got told and that didn't ever make it to this point.
Yeah.
And while that's really sad, I think it's also so important to learn from that and to say that now can we identify these barriers that these other people had to overcome in astonishing, displays of like determination, or had to suffer through being called terrible things or whatever. They got through this. But now we're aware of those barriers. So now let's go back and check and say, like, are people still being held back by this? Is this still something we know that queerness affects people. We know that race and gender and all of these things factor into the way in which you experience the world. So like, I feel like learning these stories, even though a lot of them are kind of sad, there aren't that many, like Leonardo da Vinci had a pretty dope life, but like, there aren't that many people in history who it's like, wow, and everything was great, and they were so respected in their time period and everything. A lot of times that's not the story, but we have to resist the urge to put Kevin Costner in and be like, wasn't there one? Yeah. Like, on the one hand, yes, as long as there was slavery, there were abolitionists. Like, that is true. But like, it's tempting to try to create a sympathetic white figure sometimes. But a lot of times that's not the case. And instead, I think it's better to try to really relate to these queer people of color, to try to really relate to them and give them the agency in their own stories.
There's one more name on this list of Black scientists, which is someone that I'm pretty sure everyone knows. George Washington Carver.
Oh, yeah.
From Missouri. They passed away in 1943. Which also wasn't that long ago.
Sure wasn't.
They were very important in agriculture, and they were an inventor, right? And they created over 300 uses for the peanut, which is fascinating. And my source said everything from chili sauce to shampoo, shaving cream, and glue, which rhymes, and I love that fact.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, George Washington Carver, a freed slave, hence the name, George Washington Carver. He was born like during the Civil War, 1861, and so he was freed at a young age. However, before he was freed, he and his mother, and I think one other relative, were kidnapped by another slave owner, and only George Washington Carver was ever recovered. So he didn't see his mother again for the rest of his life. And he was brilliant, but is probably the best example, just because of how many things he had to go through, of like, George Washington Carver is famous, and he was contemporaneously famous as well. He was famous in the early 1900s. He was famous up till the time of his death. Sometimes people say he invented peanut butter. He didn't, but he was known as the Peanut Man. And the reason he was so into peanuts is because cotton, which was the staple crop of the American South for centuries, seriously depletes soil. So it's not good for soil. It takes away all the nutrients. And George Washington Carver went to study agriculture, and he was a huge proponent of doing crop cycles. So doing like soybeans or legumes or peanuts to plant in a cycle with cotton, so that you have good, healthy soil, which is now considered like a standard agricultural practice to have that. But what's amazing about George Washington Carver is, again, this is a case where you can see at every step of the way how he could have been turned away. He could have not gotten to the level he was, because he like went to, he had to walk like 10 miles to go to the only desegregated school in the area. And the first day he showed up, this teacher just like wasn't there. He had to go to a school for Black children. When he was in high school, that sort of age, he was attending a different school where he then witnessed a lynching. So he left that school. And then he went to Iowa State, what would eventually become, I believe, Iowa State University. which was, their classes were desegregated, so he was allowed to pursue a graduate degree in agricultural sciences, but he was not allowed to sleep in the dormitories or use their like food dining halls, basically. So he had to live in the basement, and he ate with the staff in order to like get his degree. But then he still graduates, and he is basically the only Black man in America with this agricultural science background. So then he's picked up by the Tuskegee Institute, a famously Black academic space, and he becomes their like chief of academic or agricultural science. And I just think it's really, really interesting. Like, George Washington Carver, I don't know, for me at least, I kind of thought of him as almost like a weirdly fictional figure. Not fictional, but almost like mythological. I was like, oh yeah, the peanut guy. Like, he's that guy who loved peanuts. And I don't know, I really didn't know that much about him until I started looking into his life. And then it was like, oh geez, like, first off, he had to overcome so much to get to the position he was in, but also he was this really fascinating figure. And I just think, yeah, like, there's a lot to learn about different people. And while, yes, we don't want to ascribe modern identities, I also think, like, but we also don't want to not do it. We also don't want to just, like, we don't want to erase that part of someone's history. And, like, the fact of the matter is that George Washington Carver spent the last 15 years of his life living with a man who he, by all accounts, was extremely fond of. So, like, at some point, there is a queer identity that can be read into that, right? You can look at that and say that, like, while yes, there are heterosexual explanations for that, there also aren't. There also are like other reasons that someone might live their life like that. There's just a lot that I think it's important. But yeah, George Washington Carver. So not only a groundbreaking American Black scientist, but also potentially a member of this overlooked queer history of science in America and the world.
Right. I have two LGBTQIA plus scientists on this list. Alan Turing, who is English, known for mathematics, computing, and he was a code breaker.
Alan Turing was, an incredible. This is like the early history of computers is really, really fascinating, and code breaking as well. So the Turing test is what he's probably most well known for, which is his proposed way to test how a computer solves a problem, basically. Is a computer thinking, or is it merely receiving instructions? But I think that it's pretty important with Turing's history to look at, so Turing was homosexual, and we know this because he was convicted for acts of homosexuality, and he underwent chemical castration. So that means he took a medication that made him unable to achieve erection. Some of these chemical castrations were permanent, some of them weren't. It's pretty messed up. So that's like the same history as like conversion therapy and all those things. So that's what Alan Turing, unfortunately, a lot of that legacy is kind of embroiled in that. But Alan Turing's code breaking was pretty instrumental when it came to the US and, well, the Allied forces in general gaining an understanding of, especially I think the Battle of the Atlantic is like the specific thing that his code breaker was able to get through on. And then it's like, how is he rewarded? Well, he's rewarded because the post-World War II era of like reactive conservatism comes through. You got like McCarthyism in America, and then there's like this real persecution of gay people. And he died quite young. Probably he committed suicide. He died of cyanide poisoning at the age of 42. He had all these things about, like, what is a mind and what does it mean to think and how does it mean to choose, and all these things that I think a lot of his discoveries and a lot of his curiosities, I think that they were inextricable from his queerness, because he was so fascinated by the way that a mind works, that I think it's really hard to imagine that he didn't feel that his difference was relevant. He was a genius and he was brilliant. There's really a lot of the history of computing, especially, has a lot of women, a lot of queer folks in it. I don't know.
Mary Ann Horton on my list, who's still alive.
Yeah, Mary Ann Horton. Yeah, she's a trans woman who
really
she's a trans woman who is she came out in like 87, I think, and she's been
Wow.
really. She worked at Bell Labs in Columbus, Ohio, at the same time that my parents worked at Bell Labs in Pennsylvania. So they didn't know her, but she was doing a lot of work with the early internet and like Usenet and things like that. So a lot
Yeah,
of kind of what we.
I have here, it says they created the first email attachment tool, UUEN code, which was responsible for pretty much making email possible.
She's still a trans activist. She's live and active and doing cool computer science work. And you know, she's been out for a long time. Relatively speaking, you know, 87 was not an easy time to come out as a trans woman, and she's really cool.
If you were to give advice to anyone out there who dreams of working in STEM, but may feel that they can't due to barriers such as disabilities, gender orientation, ethnicity, etc., what would you say to them? That's a doozy, huh?
It is, and it's so important. I think, first off, that sometimes I think what keeps us from engaging with science is feeling like we're not allowed to. And I think that conversations like this one that we're having right now, like this is an act of STEM education, right? Like what we're doing is we're talking through these people, we're relating to them, we're, you know, imagining their inner lives to be able to have this kind of broader imagination of what people were like. But this is also a way in which to engage in science. So like, this is something that like, yeah, you can be anybody and do this, and it'll make science more interesting. So, you know, at the museum, a lot of times we say that our mission is to make science accessible for everybody, which is true. We want people to become part of it, but more than that, I want people to know that not only can you engage with STEM fields, but that the world will be better if you do. The more different ways of thinking, you know, the more we work with Indigenous scientists and work with their history and their background, the more we work with queer scientists, the more we work with scientists from the nations that they're living in, doing research in the countries where they are born, rather than people coming from outside to do research. In this way, we start to build a more human and more full image of what it means to pursue science. So any way of engaging with it, whether it's pursuing science and doing a science class, or whether it's sitting and having a conversation with your new best friend about the history of people in science, like this is an act of engagement. And I think that sometimes all it takes is that willingness to engage, to ask the questions, to be wrong if you need to be okay about like not knowing things. And you know, the more people we have who think differently, the more we will learn. So the more queer people we have, the more people of color we have, the more disabled people, the more we will see science moving forward and make a better world. So please come join us. The water's really warm. Please come swim.
Oh my God, stop. I need a tissue.
Careful. Oh my God. Artwork. Shoot.
Well, Sarah, I had a blast, and I just can't wait to meet you in real life. And I just want to say I hope you have a lovely evening. It was great chatting with you, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Coleslaw. Thank you for having me, and I can't wait to meet you in person. Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Now that was an intense conversation. I truly learned so much, and I want to thank Sarah for being a part of this and for sharing all this information with us. And let's just say, gee whiz. Seems like these textbooks need to be edited and rewritten. A couple things, a couple remarks, personal remarks. We demand equity in science. The whitewashing of world history in general just has to stop. Now I'd like to leave you with this. We are at a pivotal moment where we have the potential to change this country's way of thinking and behaving, away from systematic racism and towards a country that respects and protects the constitutional rights of all of its citizens. Can you imagine? This is the perfect time to dig deep within ourselves and question our modes of thinking, of which we have become accustomed to during our lives. Let us make more of a conscious effort to analyze our own actions as well as educating those closest to us. Please be kind to one another. Don't forget to vote in November. And please, wear a mask when you're in public. I literally can't. Just wear a mask. Just put it on. What are you, dumb? Have I mentioned that you look so good tonight? This is Coleslaw, signing out.
Yeah!